Hello, everyone, and welcome to Justice Talks with Church and Society. I'm Jeff Corey. If you don't know much about today's topic, Christian nationalism, you came to the right place. During today's conversation, we will define and discuss Christian nationalism and white Christian nationalism, why it's on the rise, the danger it poses to religious freedom, and what Christians can do to protect religious freedom for all. As the conversation gets underway, as always, please don't hesitate to ask questions in the chat. We plan to respond to as many questions as we can on camera as time allows. Before I pass it over to Church and Society's General Secretary, Reverend Susan Henry Crow, for her opening remarks, let me introduce our guests. Today, we are very fortunate to have with us two interfaith leading Christian nationalism experts and educators. Our first guest is Amanda Tyler. She is the Executive Director for the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty and leader of Christians Against Christian Nationalism. She is also the co-host of the Respecting Religion podcast and a member of the Texas and Supreme Court Bar. Welcome to you, Amanda.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
Also with us today is Reverend Jimmie Ray Hawkins. He is the director for the advocacy offices of the Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C., and at the United Nations in New York City. He served on the boards of Church World Service, the National Council of Churches, and the NAACP Executive Committee. Currently, he is a tri-chair of the Washington Interreligious Staff Committee. Welcome to you, Reverend Jimmie.
Thank you, Jeff, for having me as well.
Excellent. All right, Reverend Susan, I pass it on to you.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, dear colleagues, for joining. This is a very important conversation, and it's an honor to be with my friends and ecumenical partners here in Washington, D.C., presenting on this critically important topic today. As I have traveled around in the past few months, United Methodists, as well as many other people of faith, continue to ask how Christians and people of faith can engage on this critical topic. People of faith want to give witness to their faith that resists the dangers and harm done by Christian nationalism. Ecumenical and interfaith relationships are important in addressing the rise of white Christian nationalism. GBCS of the United Methodist Church, along with our ecumenical sisters and brothers, have addressed critical issues together over the decades. This is a moment that cries out for our concerted efforts, both nationally and locally. The format for today will be a presentation by Ms. Amanda Tyler with response and critical questions from Reverend Jimmie Hawkins. You, as Jeff has said, not sure where I muted myself. You're invited to put your questions in the chat. And Jeff Corey will moderate the questions and comments as time allows. So welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us. And now I turn to Amanda, and thank you for being here today, Amanda.
Oh, thank you so much, Susan. And I am looking forward to being in conversation with my friend and colleague, Jimmie Hawkins, today. And thank you to all of you who have joined us for today's conversation. It is gratifying to see that we have people joining us from all over the country. And that's an important thing because Christian nationalism is a problem that affects us all in every corner of this country. So I am going to share my screen now and hope that you all can see this and just begin the presentation. So just a very quick word about the organization that I lead, BJC, which stands for Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. We are an education and advocacy organization headquartered on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., with our close partners, ecumenical partners who are hosting us here today. Our mission is to focus on advocating for everyone's religious freedom. And we believe that the best way to do that is to make sure that the institutions of religion and government remain separate. And we've been doing this work from our faith-based perspective for 86 years. I have often said in the past couple of years that I believe that the single greatest threat to religious freedom for all today is Christian nationalism. And over the last few years, BJC's work has been to bring additional focus and understanding to Christian nationalism, and that's what brings me here today. But I put this slide up if you'd like to learn more about our work at BJC or subscribe to get our updates. You can find a link in the chat to do that as well. As we begin, I think it's always important to start with definitions. And so the definition I would offer for conversation here today for Christian nationalism is that it's a political ideology and a cultural framework that seeks to merge Christian and American identities. So it suggests that to be a true Christian, to be a true American, one has to be a Christian. And vice versa, to be a real Christian, that one has to be an American. And both of those assertions are fallacies. They violate foundational principles of American democracy. It also violates foundational principles of worldwide Christianity. And so that is what brings us to work to draw attention to Christian nationalism. Well, what are some of the markers of Christian nationalism? One, Christian nationalism relies heavily on this mythical history of the United States as a quote unquote Christian nation. When people use the words of Christian nation, they're not talking about some kind of demographic sense that a majority of Americans are Christian, because that continues to be true in public polling. Rather, they think that God has a special role for America in God's plan for the world, and that America's laws have been influenced by Christian values, that the Constitution has been divinely inspired, that our founders meant to set up a religious state to privilege and promote Christianity in doing so. These are all myths. These ideas are belied by the history and the text of the Constitution. Christian nationalism in this is also an exaggerated form of American exceptionalism, that God has a providential hand in American history and in our present politics, and that therefore we must have Christian leaders leading the country in order to carry out that plan. In understanding Christian nationalism, I think it's also important to understand what it is not. And so I want to talk a little bit about distinguishing between Christian nationalism and Christianity. Again, I define Christian nationalism as a political ideology and a cultural framework. And when I talk about a cultural framework, I mean a collection of myths and traditions and symbols, narratives, and value systems that all go into this idea of Christian nationalism. Of course, Christianity is a religion, and one that's practiced by millions and millions of people all around the world, not just in this country. The Christian and Christian nationalism, though, has more to do with identity than about religion. And when I say that, I mean it carries with it assumptions about nativism, white supremacy, authoritarianism, patriarchy, and militarism. And a helpful resource that we've put together to help understand Christian nationalism is a one-page document called What is Christian Nationalism? It's available at christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org. And I think we're also going to put a link in the chat so you can access that as well to better understand this. When we talk about, distinguishing it, though, it can be confusing. And that's because Christian nationalism uses the language and symbols of Christianity to further the ideology. We also have to distinguish Christian nationalism from patriotism. And so I want to define patriotism as a love of country. And we can express love of country in a number of different ways. We can vote. We can serve on a jury. We can participate in our community and in our civic life. We can learn about candidates and educate ourselves. We can pledge allegiance or choose not to pledge allegiance. We can protest. These are all ways to be patriotic. But nationalism is an allegiance to country that demands supremacy over all of our other allegiances, including to Jesus. And so one way I think to distinguish Christian nationalism from patriotism is to ask, is our patriotism causing us to violate our theological convictions? Are we being asked to put our allegiance to country over our allegiance to Jesus? And if that's the case, then I would argue it's no longer patriotism, it's nationalism, that we can be both faithful Christians and patriotic Americans, but we have to remember, as Jesus taught us, to understand what to render to Caesar and what to render to God, and not to get those renderings mixed up. So Christian nationalism is something that we can also study in sociology. And I want to present some polling for Christian nationalism that helps us understand Christian nationalism. So this is work taken from Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, who are two of the leading sociologists of religion who have been studying Christian nationalism for several years. Their methodology was to both a survey and individual interviews. And in the surveys, they would measure for Christian nationalism by asking a number of questions, including these three. They would ask people to rate how much they would agree or disagree with statements like these: that the federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation, the success of the United States is part of God's plan, and the federal government should advocate for Christian values. And so in doing this survey and interview work, they were able to plot Americans along a continuum of Christian nationalism. You know, at one end of the continuum, you have people who completely reject it. At the other end, you have people who are completely embracing it. And they call them ambassadors. And then you have people in the middle, the resistors and the accommodators. And I share this. First, this is from a 2020 book, so it is a little bit dated at that time, but this is from that snapshot in time where people were along this continuum. I think it's notable, one, that Christian nationalism is an ideology that permeates our society. And so it is not accurate to say that only certain people are quote unquote Christian nationalists. Just like racism permeates our society. So it's not accurate to say only certain people are racists. Instead, we think about how much we embrace the ideology and how that's spread across. Of note, the smallest group here are those who are ambassadors. I think that's a hopeful sign, one thing, that we have more people who are rejecting it completely than who have totally embraced it. Also, the majority of Americans, about 60%, are somewhere in the middle. And so I think that this kind of helps us frame Christian nationalism as how it's spread out across our society, or at least how it was in 2020. Okay, so here's some more recent polling. This was actually just released by Politico this month, but it was a poll that was taken in May. And they first asked the question, does the Constitution allow the US government to declare the United States a Christian nation? And I was heartened to see that 70% of Americans knew the answer was no, right? Our constitutional system sets up a secular government, one that doesn't take sides when it comes to religion. We have no religious tests for public office in Article 6. We have both a free exercise and a no establishment clause in the First Amendment. This is the way we protect everyone's religious freedom. And 70% of the respondents in this survey knew that was true, including a majority of both Democrats and Republicans. Okay, well, then the survey people asked this question: would you favor or oppose the United States declaring the country a Christian nation? And again, it's helpful that the majority still say we would oppose that, right? But then if you look at who's favoring it, you see that a majority of Republicans actually favor the United States being declared a Christian nation, even though a majority knows that that's not constitutional. So this is a current snapshot of where we are. And I think this shows a change in the conversation over the last couple of years, where you see more and more leaders actively, especially in the Republican Party, actively embracing Christian nationalism as a label that they want to associate with and something that is a policy goal. This is a difference that we have seen over the last couple of years. Well, I want to talk a little bit now about white Christian nationalism and how that interacts, how racism interacts with Christian nationalism. At the Christians Against Christian Nationalism Project, we use this statement that Christian nationalism often overlaps with and provides cover for white supremacy and racial subjugation. That's because Christian nationalism creates and perpetuates a sense of cultural belonging that is limited to the people who were included in the founding of the United States. That is, native-born white Christians, right? That this sense that who really counts as an American has to be dated back to those who were included at the beginning. Again, Christian nationalism operates like racism, that it's pervasive, that it's part of our history in a way that it's very difficult to extricate it completely from the American experience. That poll that I just mentioned from the University of Maryland, they also found that in polling for support for declaring the United States a Christian nation, they found that that was high, with those who wanted it declared a Christian nation, that was highly correlated with what they called white grievance. That the white respondents who say that members of their race have faced more discrimination than others are more likely to embrace Christian nationalism. And that's because Christian nationalism both creates and perpetuates this sense of an us versus them mentality. It's also because this Christian nation myth which goes back to our founding, right? Which of course included slavery. It imbues this sense of God's favor being placed on slavery and racial violence and segregation. And so the language of Christian nationalism is a more coded way that covers for more explicitly racist language. We also see the emergence of white Christian nationalism when we have these emerging fights at the local level about teaching about slavery and racism in our public schools. We see that there are groups that would much rather teach the Christian nation myth of history than a more candid accounting of American history. Well, I want to talk here just about some examples of Christian nationalism in the culture and how some of them are very obvious, some of them might be less so. So I think one of the most startling examples of Christian nationalism in public came on January 6th. And the organization that I lead, BJC, working with our secular partners, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, released a report earlier this year that is the most thorough accounting to date that I know of instances of Christian nationalism, both on January 6th itself, but also in the lead up to January 6th. And we'll put a link in the chat to this full report, which you can review on your own. But the takeaway that I would share here today, and this is something that has gotten the attention of the January 6th committees, as well as members of the media who have been reporting on the study of January 6th, is that we can't explain what happened alone based on Christian nationalism. That's not the argument. But we have to understand Christian nationalism to understand how the ideology worked to intensify the attack, how it worked to unite disparate actors, how they used Christian nationalism to try to legitimize their indefensible actions and provide a religious fervor, not just a political aim, to the actions on January 6th. And it's another reminder of how Christian nationalism in the hands of violent extremists can turn deadly. This is not the only example of that. We saw it in 2015 at Mother Emanuel AME Church. We saw it in 2018 at the Tree of Life Synagogue, and too many other examples. We saw it in Buffalo earlier this year, where these extremists were using Christian nationalism in ways that intensified their attack and led to deadly violence. But not all instances of Christian nationalism are so violent or apparent. And I want to give this example of state legislative bills that have been passed in a number of states across the country that require the posting of "In God We Trust" in public schools. And I give this as an example of Christian nationalism because, again, it sends this message that to belong in our society, and here the message being sent to young children is to belong in this school, that you affirm certain theological statements. And these bills have not just popped up organically. This has been a concerted effort from a group called the Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation that is organized and sent out a playbook that is called Project Blitz, that they've done this for many years, encouraging state legislatures to pass these bills. And in their preamble to these bills, they are explicit that this bill in particular is meant to share that it's important that we talk about our, quote, Judeo-Christian heritage and the large part that it played in the founding and the history of this country. Again, we can hear echoes of this Christian nation myth that are being perpetuated through public displays like this. And so I leave this example to say that the question isn't always, is this constitutional? But does this further an idea of religious freedom for all? Or is this sending a message of Christian privilege and that Christian laws, or that only certain people belong in this country? And I would say that the posting of a motto like this in the public schools is meant to do the latter. This is just a slide that shows that these "In God We Trust" bills are just the first step in the larger plan of the Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation to encourage legislatures to pass other bills that are, again, founded on Christian nationalism. And they're very explicit in their goals that if you do one, then they'll lead. For instance, it said, even if your bill is not enacted, it can shore up later support for other governmental entities to support religious displays. So it's a strategy that's very explicit and very open to try to end in things that, if you look at the end point here, that this really looks more like the passing of religious laws than simply posting a U.S. motto in a public school. Well, here's another example of Christian nationalism in the public square. And this actually comes directly from a case that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. This is a 40-foot cross on government land in Bladensburg, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C. It's been on this land since the early 1920s, when it was erected to honor those in the local community who had died during World War I. And years later, even though it was originally erected on private land, it was transferred to the government. And in a few years ago, the American Humanist Association challenged the government's upkeep of this cross as an example of the establishment of religion in violation of the First Amendment and its prohibition against establishments of religion. And BJC, along with a number of other groups, filed a brief in this case, and we filed on behalf of the American Humanist Association saying that, yes, indeed, that the government's upkeep of this religious monument constituted an establishment of religion. And the Supreme Court voted to keep this cross up, basically saying that to move or take down the cross now would be more divisive for the community and harm religious freedom, and therefore they would keep this monument up. But they really relied on the particular facts of this case, and notably that it had been so long before anyone raised an objection to the cross. But I raise this as an example, more as a cautionary tale of what happens when the government it starts putting up religious symbols. And that's because our brief in this case was probably not as we usually filed. We are legal experts. We file on what the First Amendment means. This brief was probably more theology than any brief we'd ever filed, because we were having to make the argument, this is unbelievable, to the U.S. Supreme Court, that the cross is indeed a religious symbol. Why would we have to argue to the US Supreme Court that the cross is a religious symbol? Because the government was actually arguing that the cross was a generic symbol of sacrifice, that it didn't have religious significance. And we filed a brief that explained the theology of the cross and explained that it was offensive for the government to be telling us that our cross didn't have religious significance. And so this is again, fortunately, the Supreme Court did not take the government's argument. They acknowledged that indeed the cross was an explicitly religious symbol, indeed the central symbol of Christianity. But I think that this is what can happen when the government starts appropriating religious symbols, when we start mixing our identities as Americans and Christians in this way. It's the Christianity that gets watered down and co-opted by the government. My last example of Christian nationalism to share with you is this. And this, we've talked about Christian nationalism as it occurs in violent ways, as it occurs in public schools, when it's in government monuments. This hits close to home for us, right? This is in a sanctuary. And my point again is not a legalistic point. This is as a Baptist, I believe in, the ability of each congregation to decide for themselves how to worship and what their worship space looks like and all of those things. But I want to point out that having an American flag on the altar of equal symbolic significance here to the Christian flag is an example of Christian nationalism. We are visually mixing our allegiances here and equating them. It poses the question, what exactly are we worshiping here? How is our identity as an American citizen important to the worship of God? I think these are theological questions that churches should be struggling with and thinking about. And if in the end they decide to keep their flag in the sanctuary, that is certainly their choice and not one that I'm going to be critical of. But it's something that I think is up to Christians to be investigating and interrogating in our own spaces. How much of what we're doing in our churches can be called Christianity and how much of it is verging into Christian nationalism territory. I want to leave you with some resources. I have only scratched the surface of what we can do and talk about as far as Christian nationalism, but we have a wealth of resources at christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org. This is an ecumenical grassroots resource for everyone. If you identify as Christian, you are invited to sign our statement of principles, where we talk about what Christian nationalism is and affirm foundational principles of religious freedom for all. But everyone can access both the list of everyone who has signed Christians Against Christian Nationalism, as well as a library of resources. And our resources include a podcast series with an accompanying discussion guide. We have a 3-part curriculum that can be used in houses of worship that is based on a webinar presentation that we did back in just 3 weeks after January 6, 2021, with Bishop Michael Curry of the Episcopal Church and Bishop Elizabeth Eaton of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, and Andrew Whitehead, one of those sociologists who've done this work. So I would just commend to you the site for information that you can use in your houses of worship and in your communities, but also things that you can put in your social media feeds and can spur more conversation. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. I'm going to stop sharing. And Jimmie, I'm going to invite you for response and questions.
Yes. I want to thank Dr. Tyler for her diligent work in helping us to articulate the dangers of Christian nationalism and her leadership in bringing clarity to the purpose and mission of the Christian faith. I'm in total agreement on the dangers of Christian nationalism as she has put forth, and my reflections and thoughts are that this heresy of Christian nationalism is old wine in new wineskins. It's been around for a very long time, but has evolved and twisted into new configurations and shapes. For there have always been those who have attempted to shift Christianity into a servant of the state and the state into a Christian nation. Rabbi Neil Combs Daniels of Beth Shear Shalom Synagogue said that the roots of Christian nationalism predate America. He said, and I quote him, Jewish Americans experience Christian nationalism through an anti-Semitic lens. In the United States, there seems to be a Christian default, end quote. It does have a long and disturbing history in this country. And this attempt to merge the faith and the state has indeed been constant. But it's been done under different titles and names: the doctrine of discovery, manifest destiny, and American exceptionalism, as Dr. Tyler has commented upon. They were all based upon a theological premise that God ordained white supremacy for the establishment of a Christian nation and to utilize the resources of this land, that the bodies and talents of people of color were all for the benefit of white Christian Americans. For we cannot miss the racial component of sin, as many refer to it as white Christian nationalism. The doctrine of discovery said that Christian nations could discover and claim foreign lands in the name of their monarch if the land was populated by other peoples who were non-civilized or non-Christians. Manifest destiny, the ideology that the United States was divinely ordained by God to control the American continent from top to bottom. American exceptionalism has always been vocalized in the theological terminology. For presidents have spoken of America as an empire of liberty, a shining city on a hill, the last best hope on earth, placed there by the hand of God. But in my tradition as a Black clergy, Black theology has long criticized the false theological justification by those who supported the sins of racist ideology as the responsibility of the state upheld by the laws and policies of the United States in connection with what it means to be a person of faith. Frederick Douglass, in his famous speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," accused the Christian church to what amounts to a charge of Christian nationalism. He said, "The church of this country is not only indifferent to the wrongs of the slave, it actually takes sides with the oppressors." The late James Cone, many of us have heard him speaking, especially with his book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, wrote, and I quote him, "It is ironic that America, with its history of injustice to the poor, especially the Black man and the Indian, prides itself on being a Christian nation." And Martin Luther King Jr. wrote that the church must be reminded that it is not the master or the servant of the state, but rather the conscience of the state. It must be the guide and the critic of the state, and never its tool. If the church does not recapture its prophetic zeal, it will become an irrelevant social club without moral or spiritual authority. So I guess, Dr. Tyler, as we have this conversation, what factor does race play in Christian nationalism?
Well, thank you for those really excellent words. I not noted where you said this idea that God ordained white supremacy. And I think that those assumptions are built into this Christian nation myth. This sense that that God, wanted all of that. And we have that not just at the founding, but when we look through the Civil War and the way that denominations were split over the question of slavery, how sacred texts were interpreted to justify slavery throughout that period, to justify Jim Crow segregation. These are all examples of Christian nationalism, of theological convictions being perverted in order to serve power and to serve the state and to serve the evil of slavery in this way. You are absolutely correct that Christian nationalism is not new. It has run alongside our aspiration of religious freedom for all throughout the American experience. I think there has always been a disconnect between who we say we are and who we really are. And from a theological perspective, that sense of integrity is core also to our human experience and to becoming the people that God wants us to be. And so I think as we live in our American context, we are called to reject Christian nationalism, to acknowledge the fact that even with our constitutional protections of religious freedom for all, that Christian nationalism and white Christian nationalism have interfered with our ability to live into that ideal. I'll give one example of the way that, I mentioned in my presentation that the language of Christian nationalism can be a more coded way to express racism. And I think one example of that comes from the state of Mississippi. You might remember a few years ago that the voters of Mississippi finally voted to remove the Confederate battle flag from their state flag. But when the state legislature of Mississippi put that up for a vote for the voters to decide, they required that the new flag design contain the words "In God We Trust." So this idea, this coded language of belonging, of Christian nationalism, directly replaced the Confederate battle flag on the state flag of Mississippi. And so I think in this way, Christian nationalism and white Christian nationalism can be even more difficult to extricate and dismantle because it goes undercover and it wraps itself in the legitimacy and the love of God and Jesus in so doing. And so I think it is incumbent on those of us who still claim Christianity to be really central to the conversation of extricating it from ourselves first and then in the greater society.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I really want to highlight something that I think that is going to be an issue in the life of many of the members of our congregations, whether it's United Methodist or Baptist or Presbyterian, is your conversation on the placement of the flag in the sanctuary. I mean, that has been an issue with me since my ordination. And I still remember when I was talking with the pastor nominating committee, and I knew that the church had a flag in the sanctuary, and I asked them, I said, well, I'm going to share with you, that's going to be an issue with me. And of course, they sidestepped, said, well, you're going to have to talk with the session about that, which is our governing body. We're just here to hire a pastor. But I do think that's an example that you really hit upon. And I still remember after 9/11, I was riding in North Carolina, and a church had placed a flag over the entrance of the church so that every member of the church had to walk under the American flag to enter into the church. And so I think this is something that we have accepted because we see it all the time. There are no questions, there are no theological questions from even the clergy asking, what's the relationship between the flag and the cross? Could you say a little more about that, about how we have just we have fallen in line with this, and not even when we see the flag, it really doesn't register any disturbance with us at all.
Yeah. And, I use that in presentations, and it always generates the most conversation in the chat whenever I put it up there, because I think so many people have that personal experience of seeing the flag or of trying to remove it. I saw on Twitter one time, I think it was Andrew Whitehead posted, here's a great test for Christian nationalism in your congregation. Try to remove the American flag and see what happens next. Right? And that's because how Christian nationalism has gotten so embedded in our culture is because we have gone a long time without questioning some of these assumptions. And so that's really what we're trying to do at Christians Against Christian Nationalism, is to engage first in some self-reflection. Why is it so important to us to have this symbol at the front of the congregation? I've heard from some communities, particularly churches who serve more immigrant communities, that that's an important sign of belonging for them, actually, to claim the American flag for themselves, that perhaps they have fled a totalitarian regime somewhere else, and they are proud to be able to freely worship. And they want to show that. So that's an example of something that, again, I think it can be very personal to each congregation to why that's an important symbol for their congregation. But I think that the vast majority of congregations haven't had this kind of reflection and haven't thought about, well, what is the history? When did that first go up there? What are we really worshiping here? And these are like I said, theological questions that I think are worthy of our thoughtful consideration in a community of love and support, which our churches hopefully are. That if we can't have these conversations in church, where can we have them? And so I think that we should start trying to have some of these deeper conversations in church. And again, I'm not here to tell everyone to take their flags out of the sanctuary. I'm just asking you to have a conversation about it.
Mhm. Well, I know we want to leave some time for Q&A, but I'm going to ask you one more to maybe the last 15 minutes. We can see what's on in the chat box. And related to the question about the flag, prayer in the school, you know, oftentimes we hear that as if it's a panacea. If we can only get prayer back in the school, then all of the problems of school will be erased. But I also think it's a way of letting ourselves off the hook, you know, where we don't have to do anything. We just get prayer back in the school, and that would take care of school inequity. That would take care of school to prison pipeline. What are some of you say a little bit more? I know you mentioned it in your presentation about how do you talk to someone that says, well, all we need to do is put prayer back in the school and everything's going to be okay.
Yeah. Well, first, I would challenge them that prayer never got taken out of public school. And that's because the ability for students and teachers to engage in their own religious exercise in ways that don't interfere with the school day and the duties that they each have being at public school, that has never changed. My predecessor, Dr. James Dunn, his famous line was, as long as there are math tests, there will be prayer in school, right? So this idea that private exercise has always been protected. What changed in the 1960s was the US Supreme Court made clear that government-sponsored, teacher-led religious exercise violates religious freedom. That's because it is not the job of government to indoctrinate our students. It's not the job of government to lead in religious exercise. And that was still being done in a number of our public schools until those decisions came down. And so I believe that the prohibition against government-led religious exercise in public schools is a good thing. I am deeply concerned about a Supreme Court decision that came out of the state of Washington last term. It's a case called Kennedy versus Bremerton, where the Supreme Court issued a ruling in favor of a football coach who is a public school teacher, public school employee, who was leading in religious exercise with his students. Now, the Supreme Court adopted a different set of facts that basically set it up as if he was privately praying, and I take issue with their vision of the facts. But in deciding the case, they threw into question how strong is that protection going forward for religious freedom? Will we have government-led religious exercise in the public schools? And that is, again, another example of Christian nationalism, because it's our government sending a message that to belong in this place, you have to profess a certain thing. And it could be any religion that they're trying to lead the students in. That's not the government's role. And so I think it's particularly incumbent on all of us now to be vigilant if we see examples of government-sponsored religious exercise in our public schools, to stand against those and to explain that doing so is not about being anti-religion. Exactly the opposite. It's about protecting religious freedom and protecting the ability for parents to be able to control the religion and the religious choices for their children.
Okay, excellent feedback. And Jeff, did you want me to do the Q&A, or were you going to handle that?
I'll take that. I'll take it from you, Mr. Reverend Hawkins. Thank you both for that very insightful presentation, both insightful presentations and comments around this crucial topic. We've got a lot of questions, and I will get to as many as I can. I just want to thank Leslie, Stephen, Martha, Charlie, Julius, Connie, Carol for all their thoughts and comments, and we'll ask some of these questions. One thing that we heard a lot in terms of one question to you, Amanda, is can they get a copy of your presentation? We will be We are recording this, and we will drop this presentation into our YouTube page, where people can look at the presentation over and over. But if someone actually wants to access the presentation, is that something you have on BJC?
Yeah, I'll get a copy to you all so that you can include the slides in what you send out. Absolutely.
Okay. Here's a question from Stephen that is pretty interesting. He says, how do we learn to recognize Christian nationalism as another form of racism in our society? How do we call it out? How do we dismantle it? And is the Supreme Court decision on abortion an example of Christian nationalism?
I'm sorry, Jeff, was that directed at
you, Amanda?
Okay. I'll do the second. Will you repeat the first part of the question? I'm sorry.
Sure. I think they want to know, how do you call it out and how do you dismantle it? Which is the action part, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I think first I would say, and this presentation today is part of it, is become as educated as you can about what it is and learn how to spot it in its many forms. Because Christian nationalism as an ideology helps prop up all kinds of other policy arguments or rhetoric in the public square. And I think something that not just our project, our ecumenical project, all of us, but the many other people who have drawn attention, the researchers, the scholars, the journalists who have drawn attention to Christian nationalism, help us give language and help understand what is going on. And, again, my field is advocacy for religious freedom for all. And for a number of years, we have seen these very strange arguments that are masqueraded in the language of religious freedom, but that are actually arguing for Christian privilege or Christian supremacy. And now that we have the language and the understanding of what Christian nationalism is, that helps us, I think, better articulate what's really going on. And so I would just, suggest that people, use the language of Christian nationalism or white Christian nationalism when they see it to help identify what it is. But in doing so, remain humble, right? Our scriptures tell us to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly, and to understand that we're all impacted by Christian nationalism. This is not about pointing fingers. This is about helping us all as a society live up to our calling, which is to love God and love our neighbors, and that we're doing that by distinguishing between Christian nationalism and Christianity. The second question about the Dobbs decision, it's hard to know all of what went into the writing of the opinion and what motivated the opinion itself. I'll note that the word religion doesn't come up in the opinion, right? The Justice Alito went out of his way to not mention religion in the opinion itself. But where I'm concerned about Christian nationalism coming up is now that we're in a post-Roe world. I think we will see efforts in state legislatures to pass what are essentially religious laws, to take an explicitly religious justification based on scripture. And when I say explicit, I mean actually that's what legislators will say that they're doing. And we're seeing that already in some of the language around total bans, the criminalization, even in some cases advocating for the death penalty for women who receive abortions. The language around all of this is very much rooted in a particular reading of the Bible. And I think that, one thing that we can learn as a cautionary tale from looking around the world is the danger of having religious laws and a theocracy. And it's important that we stand firmly against that. And I think that the Dobbs decision is one thing to watch out for, but there are other examples of the Supreme Court eroding protections for civil liberties and individual rights in ways that are very concerning, and that's happening at the same time that we see explicit calls that we as a country adopt Christian nationalism. That more recent polling I was pointing out shows a real turn in the way that people are talking about Christian nationalism right now. That there are politicians who are explicitly embracing the term and aspiring to it. That should cause real concern for all of us who care about religious freedom.
Excellent. Thank you so much. This is for you, Reverend Jimmie. Leslie wants to know, do you think Christian nationalism is based on white supremacy, or is white supremacy based on Christian nationalism?
An excellent, excellent question. I mean, it's really intertwined. You know, in the history of this country, I think that we oftentimes think that there's always been this dichotomy between the races, especially if you look at Black and white relations. But, you know, back in 1619, when the first indentured Black servants brought here, a Black person was not automatically enslaved permanently. They could become free. And so white supremacy became the justification for slavery, especially for people of faith. Because if you are a Christian, how do you justify owning another person? You've got to say that God ordained this. This is God's business, you know, and that the Bible in Genesis 9 and 10 with the curse of Ham, then the fall of the African nations, therefore Black people are preordained. And so they are intertwined, the development of Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism and white supremacy. You really can't separate the two as you look at the history of this country and as it has unfolded. The tragedy is that white supremacy became a concept that became closely identified with being an American. You know, everything was based on being white in this country. And so it impacted theology, it impacted politics, it impacted the cultural norms in society, the way we engaged or did not engage with one another. So since around 1661 in this country, white supremacy has been the doctrine, even in times when it was not so strongly stated, that has impacted every aspect of life. And so I do think that white supremacy impacted the precepts and concepts that we developed according to our faith. Because when you read the fathers and mothers of the faith, St. Augustine, they didn't talk about race. It was only when slavery became a factor in human history that you have to have a theological justification for this enslavement of one race over another. So I do think that white supremacy, once it took root in this country, it infected every aspect of life. And not only in this country, but also we know it has spread all around the world now.
Thank you so much. Amanda, we're going to bounce back to you. Charlie was talking about the rise of Christian nationalism that we had mentioned and the trends and outlook for the next 10 to 20 years that you just highlighted. What, from your perspective, is the sense of urgency now when both you and Reverend Jimmie made a case that this has been a historical issue for a very long time in this country? So are the trends really exaggerated, where it's something that we need to take action now and forever forget about winning this battle? What's your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the time we live in. I think there were, I think in our history, there were other critical moments that required people to stand up and say something. When we think about the incredible violence that has been perpetrated in the name of white Christian nationalism across the years, right? So I don't think this is the only critical moment in our history, but it's ours. And here's what I think makes this moment particularly important, and I would argue dangerous. You know, one is the impact that Christian nationalism is having on American democracy itself. We talked a little bit about January 6th, and you know, those of us who are in Washington, you know, our offices, our ecumenical offices are all here, you know, practically in the shadow of the Capitol. This hit very close to home for us. We know how close that came to really an awful outcome on January 6th. And so we've had a warning about just what can happen when Christian nationalism is combined with extremism, with lies about the election, with misinformation. And so we don't see that abating unfortunately. We're on the edge of another election here. We're just 2 years away from another presidential election. We know that there are very real threats to democracy when we have candidates who are saying, as they're running for office now, they might not accept the election results if they lose. And then when you add Christian nationalism into it, when you add this idea that God has preordained an election result, that there is a certain candidate that is God's candidate, that candidates are Messiah type figures, that they're meant to bring Christian laws and values into the government, that adds a whole nother dimension to the struggle here. It is not just a political matter. It has become a religious matter for some people. And I think understanding that and is really key to this. We're also, just very quickly, we're seeing this also, we're talking about it as an American problem here. We're seeing this on the international stage as well. We see it in Hungary. We see it in Italy with the election of the new prime minister there. Her election has been celebrated by leaders here as a win for Christian nationalism. And so this is a global concern as well for democracy and against authoritarianism.
Right. This is such an important topic that time flew by. We've got about 2 more minutes, and Julia said that they want to hear from Reverend Susan Henry Crow. They've never seen her be this quiet for so long. So you got about a couple minutes, Susan, and then we'll close it out.
Thank you so much. That was the plan. We wanted to hear from our ecumenical sisters and brothers, and I was going to be quiet. So the work of GBCS certainly continues on. We have put in the chat the resolutions on religious freedom of the United Methodist Church. And of course, we have other links from Jimmie and Amanda about the particular work that they're doing. This is a wonderful example of how faith communities come together and support one another, and even represent or speak in solidarity with our Muslim and our Jewish brothers and sisters. And this is an important journey that we will continue and carry on. And as those of us who are gathered here who are Christian, we need to continue to figure out how we give witness to our Christian faith that does not carry with it both white supremacy and Christian nationalism in the political way in which Amanda defined it and laid it out. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you. We will also continue to remember those who in recent days have been hit by the storm and those in Florida today. So let us walk into the world with justice and grace and peace. Thank you all.
Thank you, Susan. And from all of us at Church and Society, may God continue to bless and keep you. Peace until next time. Bye-bye.